Okay, today we'll be studying Revelation 6, verses 1 through 8. As I've already told the class here, for those who are online, we're going to read these verses, but the majority of today's lesson will not even get into these verses. It will be focused on the timing, whether this is future or something else. That's very important to how to understand Revelation, and it deserves an argument and explanation. So we will spend our day today doing that, and next week we will actually get into these verses directly. So we will read them, and for no other purpose maybe than to give you some idea of why we desperately need to pause and figure out, okay, when is this going to happen? Is it already happening or whatever? Here we go, verses 1 through 8. Then I saw when the Lamb broke one of the seven seals, I heard one of the four living creatures saying, as with a voice of thunder, "Come." I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. When he broke the second seal, I heard the second living creature saying, "Come." And another, a red horse, went out. To him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another. And a great sword was given to him. And he broke the third seal. I heard the third living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard something like a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. And do not damage the oil and the wine." When the Lamb broke the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature saying, "Come." I looked, and behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beast of the earth. Heads up, everybody here online, you may want to have Matthew 24 available. Here in a short amount of time, we'll be looking at it very particularly, as well as Daniel 9. That's just a forewarning. So before we get into today's text, and we really won't get into it much directly today, we need to make sure that we are following the unfolding visions of John. In chapters 4 and 5, we are given visions of God's throne. In chapter 5, verse 1, John says, "I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a book written inside and on the back, sealed up with 7 seals." He goes on to introduce Jesus as the one who is worthy to break these seals and unlock the contents of the book. As we discussed previously, some commentators will argue, as James Montgomery Boyce does, that the breaking of these seals happens over the course of history since the time of Christ's ascension into heaven. I am not unsympathetic with this view. Certainly some of what is revealed certainly coincides with the flow of history. For example, the world has suffered famine and war of plenty, both of which will come into play when the seals are broken. Nonetheless, the world suffered such things even before Christ ascended. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 10, Jesus makes this promise to the church. And I quote, "Because you have kept the word of my perseverance, I also will keep you from the hour of testing, that hour which is about to come upon the whole world to test those who dwell on the earth." In saying this, it would appear that a future time of testing would come. What he calls the hour of testing. That will come. As we follow along with John and read chapters 4 and 5, we find no significant proof that the breaking of the seals will occur in the future. This absence of crystal clear timestamp causes chapter 6 to become the point where commentators begin to go their separate ways. As Doug Wilson puts it, they, and I'm quoting, "come to the point where Christian interpreters shake hands with each other in order to part company, not to be reunited again until the resurrection of the dead in chapter 20. So, hence the reason why we're taking this excursion today. Honestly, I have no choice. I have to do this if we're going to really try to do a good job of our study here. So all these interpreters are aware of Matthew 24, where Jesus, in his discussion on the signs of his return, follows the order of John's vision of the seals. So let's read chapter 24 of Matthew, verses 1 through 16. Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them and said to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and will mislead many. And you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place. But that is not yet the end." Just as a side note, stop for 1 minute. That's the second seal. Talks about wars. Okay? We'll deal with the first seal was next week. Okay? We'll just give you a little bit of a hint. "For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes." Now we're into the third seal. Okay? "But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pains. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many, because of lawlessness is increased. Most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains." Now let's consider this passage with the understanding that we are trying to discern whether these events happen throughout history of the church or at some future time. As I've already said, we need to take the time to do this because John leaves us somewhat in the dark. The disciples query Jesus about the sign of his coming and of the end of the age. Jesus begins his answer by cautioning them about being deceived and misled by what will unfold before the end. He mentions the coming of false teachers and wars, and then says those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. He then adds to his list famines and earthquakes. All these things are what he calls merely the beginning of birth pains. After saying this, Jesus begins his next verse by mentioning the martyrdom of the saints. It is noteworthy that he introduces what he says with the word "then." Does this mean that martyrdom would only occur after the birth pains? That cannot be the case, since Christians have been martyred since the beginning. Jesus continues by speaking about a worldwide hatred of God's people, a falling away of many who claim to be his people, more false prophets appearing and succeeding in their efforts, lawlessness increasing, and love of people growing cold. All these things have occurred and continue to occur even in our time. In a recent sermon, I think maybe 2 sermons back on Sunday, I actually spoke of it in that regard, because it has happened throughout Christian history. Jesus appears to affirm this in chapter 24:13 when he says, "But the one who endures to the end," excuse me 1 minute, "he will be saved. In saying this, it seems to me that Jesus may be blurring the line a little bit between birth pains and the end of the age. The saints are expected to endure in the present all the way up until the end of the age. As they continue to endure despite many among them apostatizing, the gospel would continue to be preached. As we will see later, the gospel continues to be preached even during the events that unfold in Revelation. We will deal with that as we come to it in our study of Revelation. What I've said so far greatly supports the idea that Jesus' response to his disciples in Matthew 24, at least up to and including verse 14, covers the whole of church history. That is possible. I think if you read it, I think you can easily see why somebody would suggest that. And yet the disciples were asking specifically about signs of the end of the age. It could be that Jesus is speaking about a particular time in the future where all these things that are mentioned become more pronounced. In verses 15 and 16 of Matthew 24, Jesus finally gives us a particular event that offers us a clear timestamp. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand that those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. This, brothers and sisters, is an extremely important point as far as timing goes. Now we must turn to Daniel for help in understanding the timing of events mentioned in Matthew 24 and Revelation. Before we do, though, I must draw your attention to Revelation 13:5, where John says that the Antichrist will be given the authority to act 42 months. This period of time equals 3.5 years. That's a part of this discussion about the abomination of desolation. We will go to Daniel and continue to develop why all this is important. Now we're in Daniel chapter 9, verses 24 to 27. And in terms of eschatological references in the Old Testament, I don't think you'll find any verses that are more important than these verses. They are extremely central to, at least to your attempt to understand Revelation. They're very important. 70 weeks, we're reading again, Daniel 9, 24, 27. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Then after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the Prince who is to come will destroy the city and sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Jerry K. Jouet, I believe is how he pronounces his name, rightly points out that Daniel 9, and I'm quoting, is the only passage in Scripture that dispensationalists can argue for a future 7-year tribulation. That's actually true for the whole 7-year period. Okay? You will find nothing in Revelation that tells you there's a 7-year tribulation or tells you specifically, and the 7 years starts now. There is nothing there. I wish John had included that. So this writer interprets this passage symbolically. Specifically says that this passage is telling us something about Christ, the Messiah, who was cut off in his crucifixion. Dispensationalists take a different approach to this passage, noting that Daniel makes predictions that seem to line up with those of Christ in Matthew 24 and 25. John MacArthur argues that Daniel's 70th week is the eschatological era, as that which was referred to by Jesus. The initial 69 weeks occur between the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince. This decree and its timing are mentioned in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 through 8. In approximate terms, this decree occurs 450 years before the advent of Christ. And since 69 weeks represents a period of 483 years, that's calculated by 7 years added for each week. Jesus died somewhere between 30 to 33. This period seems to line up with historical unfolding of events prophesied by Daniel. There is various ways to interpret all that, various people who disagree, but I'm not getting into all that. It more or less lines up. And some of the information, we're not exactly sure at what date things happen, but it's more or less in line with what we know. At the close of the 69 week, the Messiah will be cut off. After this, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. This event occurred in AD 70. This was a time after the 69th week and before the final week mentioned later by Daniel. So we're missing a week. All those years were 69 weeks, and we've had 2,000 years. 69 weeks were covered in, let's say, 450 years. That's 2,000 years since Christ died, and almost that much even since the temple fell. Next, Daniel writes, and at its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. Commentators will often admit that this part of verse 26 is somewhat unclear. The first part, its end will come with a flood, likely refer to overwhelming devastation that was wreaked upon Jerusalem in AD 70. The remainder could be interpreted as a reference to future destruction of Jerusalem. Since this conclusion contradicts Zechariah 14, 1 through 3 and Revelations 11, 2, it is best to conclude that Daniel has the historical period surrounding the earlier destruction of Jerusalem in mind. Verse 27, he, that is the prince who is to come, mentioned in verse 26, will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Here's that week we're missing. Here's that week we're missing in an extremely important verse. And by the way, we'll mention this a little bit next week. And we'll mention Matthew 24 a little bit next week. At no point in history has the events mentioned by Daniel that mark this final period of 7 years occurred. At some point in the future, this prince, who is the Antichrist, will make a firm covenant with many of the Jews, unbelieving Jews that is, at the beginning of the 70th week. After this, at the middle of the week, that is a period of 3.5 years, this prince will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering. To do this, the Jews will need to have reconstructed the Jerusalem temple so that they might return to the practice of making such sacrificial offerings. After this happens, a final period of devastation will unfold. Other verses that reference this final 3.5 year period are Daniel 7, verse 25. Hugely important, Revelations chapter 12, verse 14. It calls it a time, times, and half a time. It's interpreted as 3.5 years. Revelations 11:3, Revelations 12:6, both say 1,260 days. Revelations 11:2 and 13:5 say 42 months. Okay? So the evidence for the final 3.5 years is extremely solid. Okay? All right. So let's recap. We are trying to discern the timing of the events mentioned in chapter 6. We have found no clear time marker exists until John mentions the authority will be given to the Antichrist for 42 months. This gives us a solid point of contact with Jesus' words in Matthew 24 and Daniel's prophecy. We know from Daniel that there will be a 7-year period because the Antichrist will make a covenant with Israel. And this marks the beginning of this final period. To be clear, this reveals that Israel will again enjoy a degree of prominence in the unfolding of God's eschatological calendar. In Revelation, it is noteworthy that the church is never once mentioned from chapter 4 until chapter 22, verse 16. Even though the letter is written to the churches. It says that, all right, in chapter 1. This does not mean that the church is no longer exists, but it does mean that Israel seems to become the focal point of God's revelation in these final years. Okay? The question remains concerning whether the events of Revelation 6 are to be included in these final 7 years. It is possible that these events begin sometime before, and that the final 7-year period begins at some point before the abomination of desolation breaks this covenant with Israel. For my part, I do not take this view, even though so far in my discussion I have tried to give this view as much respect as possible, because I truly believe that such respect is due. We cannot deny that, number one, Revelations isn't clear when that 7-year period starts. We also have to affirm that those first several seals in particular, actually quite a many of them, I mean, that stuff's been happening, right? And so I can understand how people can struggle with that. With that being said, I will take the position that the breaking of the seals coincides with the beginning of the final 7-year period. I do this for several reasons. First, I have repeatedly noted the theme of Christ coming in judgment in Revelation. Okay? We're in a time of grace. We're in a time of the church where the church is prominent. We see the church decreasing in prominence, focuses once again more and more on Israel. It's more and more a time of judgment for the world. So he begins his judgment with the church in chapters 2 and 3. After this, John has a vision from heaven where he sees the sealed book. The breaking of the seals in John's account and his visions comes after Christ judges his church. As I've already mentioned, John no longer even mentions the church until the end of this letter. This has the effect of helping the reader focus away from the church and more directly upon Israel. In the past, God judged Israel. In the Old Testament, we find God judging them severely because of their sin, while the nations never received the same level of attention. Through it all, God always preserved a remnant, and I would argue that he will do the same with the church. Jesus, after all, reveals that many will fall away. Nonetheless, the true saints will endure even during the final years of tribulation. Affirming this, John in chapter 13, verse 10, mentions the perseverance and faith of the saints. Okay, that's in Revelation 13:10, to be clear. He mentions that during this final period. The church in Revelation will endure a time of judgment, much like the faithful remnant of Israel had to endure God's judgment of their nation. By the way, just to let y'all know, when God's judgment came down, the prophet Jeremiah, despite all the prophecies that prophesied judgment, he also included a word of God about a remnant being preserved, even through all of that. God's church, after all, is scattered throughout the nations, and its membership includes false converts. God will judge the world at the end of times, and the church will be cleansed of all who are not true believers. As this judgment is unfolding, and to be clear, it will be unfolding among the Israelite members of the church as well. God will at the same time accomplish a mighty work of redemption among the people Israel. The Old Testament has many prophecies that point to this, and we find evidence in the New Testament as well. To be clear, even those who aren't dispensationalists, some of them affirm an end-time gathering of Israel based on particularly what Paul says in Revelation 11. When we come to the end of chapter 5, we are presented with a worship scene from heaven. In heaven, Christ is worshiped for his work of redemption and his establishment of God's people as, quote, a kingdom and priest to our God. That's in verse 9. After the elders and perhaps the angels sang a new song about this, John says this next. Then I looked, and I heard a voice of many angels around the throne, and the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was myriad of myriads and thousands of thousands. When we studied the identity of the elders previously, it was argued the elders represent the entirety of God's saved people. Here, the elders, along with the angels, number in the myriads. They are countless, in other words. This strongly suggests that John has a future in mind where so many saints have been gathered into heaven that it could be rightly said that they are myriad. When we examine the first 4 seal judgments in chapter 6, we will find some evidence that those judgments are worldwide. First, they are not directed to any particular people. Second, the breaking of the second seal caused peace to be taken from the earth, the whole earth. Third, the breaking of the fourth seal leads to 1/4 of the world being killed. Fifth, these first 4 seals in context of Revelation are part of a larger story that clearly recounts the judging of the world as a whole. All of this to say, I would argue that the seal judgments mark the turning point of history, back to where Israel will once again enjoy prominence in the unfolding of God's eschatological plans for the entirety of his people. In keeping with this decision, I will argue that the ordering of Revelation accords with what John MacArthur has to say in the following quote. Each of the scroll's 7 seals represents a specific divine judgment that will be poured out sequentially on the earth. The seals encompass the entire period of tribulation, culminating with the return of Christ. It seems best to understand the first 4 seals as taking place during the first half of tribulation, the 5th stretching from the first to the second half, called the Great Tribulation in chapter 7, verse 14, and lasting 3.5 years, and the 6th and 7th taking place during the Great Tribulation. The Great Tribulation is the final 3.5 years. Apparently, the 7th, we're still reading MacArthur here. Apparently, the 7th seal contains the 7 trumpet judgments, and the 7th trumpet contains the 7 bowl judgments. These 7 seals thus contain all the judgments to the end when Christ returns. So that covers how we're going to understand the flow of Revelation. There will be yet another interlude that will I believe, cover salvation history. We'll get into that when we get in it. But that's the basic outline of the timeline and the flow of Revelation. And that concludes today's discussion.